Hello everybody, welcome to part 2 of this chess endgame demonstration of king versus king and knight and rook pawn. And so in part 1 I went over some ways that the defending side with less material can hold a draw or pull out a stalemate, but in this part 2 we'll show how the side with the extra material can force a win. And so in this position, it's white's turn to move. So what would you do here in this position with white's turn to move? How would you proceed here? And what would your plan be to get that pawn, the rook pawn on h6 to promote? All right, you can pause the video if you need to, and I'm going to go ahead and turn on the analysis. All right, so we see here white is winning. It shows a mate in 25. Okay, and so the best move here is to move your king forward. So h4, and now black has a choice here. They can move to h7. They could move to f7, but that move, well, both of these moves show mate in 20. But here's one possibility. If they move up here, then the king just moves in closer to help protect this pawn and relieve the knight of guard duty. And so this knight, one mistake might be to push it up here onto f7 and try and guard the h7 square, but this could lead to possible stalemates. So the knight needs to maneuver up here to f7 to help keep the king out of the corner. And then the king will move up to g6, and with the king and knight together, this pawn will force the black king out of this corner and be able to promote. And so in this example, if he played king to f7 and then king to g5, the knight or the king would have to move back over to prevent this pawn from promoting or try to stop it. The computer wants to just move into the center of the board and let it promote to a queen, and it might take longer. But in a normal game, your opponent would probably stay in the corner trying to stop this pawn, and otherwise they would resign. So they stay in the corner. The king has moved up to help the pawn. You do not want to push the pawn now, or it would just be a stalemate. So now the knight must remaneuver over here to f7 to keep the king out of this corner. And so the king would move, and now the pawn can move forward. And if the king stays in the corner to block that pawn, it would be a mate with the knight at f7. And so to avoid that, another option is, so if we go back to the very beginning, the king moves up to h4 here. And then if the king instead, which this move is probably more common, just moves to h7 to block the pawn, then white's king moves up once again to protect this pawn and relieve the knight of this guard duty so that the knight may move around to f7 to help control and keep the king out of this corner. So the king moves up to the corner. Now the king moves even closer to help guard this h7 square. And if the king moves to grab the opposition, now the knight repositions itself up here where it will swing over to f7. And if the king tries to stay in the corner, we have knight to f7 check. The king must move. And now the pawn can move up with check. And after the king moves, because the knight keeps him out of the corner, he has to move away. And now we have the pawn promoting to a queen with check, and the game would end like this. King moves out, then check, and once the king moves, a mate here. And so that was an interesting example of how the side with more material must keep the pawn on the 6th rank and not push it up too early, which would allow stalemate possibilities, which I showed that in the first part, the previous video, which you can check out. All right, so let's see. I'll move on to a second example here. Okay. So, and once again, sorry, I forgot to cover up the evaluation. So here it's white's turn to move, and in this position, white must get his knight back over to guard this pawn. And so knight to e6 must be played. If we go back, that's the only move that allows white to win and avoid a draw. So knight to e6, and then the king comes up to attack the pawn, and now the knight must guard that pawn. But white could make a mistake here. If the knight guards the pawn by moving in front of the pawn, then king to b6 would be played, attacking the knight. And this would be a draw because the knight's under attack. And if the king would just move up, then the knight would be captured, and so the game may continue like this. Capture of the knight, the pawn moves up, and then black would be able to stop this pawn from promoting. And also after knight to c7 and the king to b6 move, of course, if the knight would move away, the pawn would just be captured, and a king and knight cannot win against a lone king. It's not enough material to force a checkmate. Okay, so if we go back to the beginning here, we'll see what white should have done. So the knight must move to the help, to the move and protect the pawn. Excuse me. So after king to a7, the right move is to protect the pawn from behind, to move behind the pawn and protect it. So the difference between this and moving forward is that now if the king moves to b6 to attack the knight, he cannot capture this knight or he'll be too far behind the pawn to stop it. So if he would capture, then the pawn would just march forward and he could not stop it in time. And so the game would play out with, excuse me, I went back to the beginning. So king to e6, or sorry, knight to e6, the king blocks, the knight protects from behind the pawn, and then if the king attacks, white is not worried here because if the king takes the knight, the pawn will just march forward. And so now the king can just move up, and if black just blocks the pawn, the king moves up further until white is able to move up here to b5 and protect the pawn, relieving this knight of this guard duty on this pawn. So the knight is now free to move away, and the knight, as in the previous example that I showed you, the knight will try to get up here to c7 to guard and keep the king out of this corner here. And so after the king goes into that corner now, the king moves up to cover a7. And so the king is forced to move over, and then we have the knight repositioning to e7, or excuse me, e6, where he can jump into c7 here and keep the black king out of the corner there. So after the king moves into the corner, we have knight to c7 check, king moves. Now the pawn is free to march up, promote to a queen with check, and a checkmate similar to the last game. And so that is how the side with the winning material will refrain from moving the pawn to the 7th rank until the king is there to guard it. Because once that pawn moves to the 7th rank and the knight is stuck guarding that pawn, then if the king gets into that corner, stalemate possibilities will happen, as I showed in the part 1, the previous video. So you can check that out to see how the stalemate occurred. But anyway, in this position, the side with the extra material should win if they hold their pawn on the 6th rank until the king can get up to that pawn and protect it. And then you swing your knight over here to c7 or f7 if it's in this corner. But you put your knight up here on the 7th rank where it can guard and keep the opposing king out of the corner and drive him out of there. All right, well, I hope you enjoyed these 2 examples of this chess endgame with king versus king, knight, and rook pawn. And if you've enjoyed these videos, please like and subscribe, and feel free to leave comments or suggestions. Thank you, everyone, and have a great day.